Thanks for being here, everybody. We're very lucky today to have David Kilcullen as our guest. And by the way, before I forget, I want to give a special shout out to the men of the 23rd Marine Regiment who are here as our guests. Thank you for your service. David Kilcullen is a counterinsurgency expert. He first, at least, came to my attention as part of the surge in Iraq in 2007, but his resume goes much deeper than that. Today he's going to talk about what he's doing nowadays, which involves some work with Google, actually, on Syria. He's been an advisor to General David Petraeus and Condoleezza Rice, and is now operating a consulting service in Virginia where he deals with all sorts of interesting stuff, which he'll be happy to tell you about. So please give a warm welcome to David Kilcullen.
Thank you. It's actually great to be here on such a beautiful day in San Francisco. I was talking to a guy last night who said, you know, the problem with San Francisco is it kind of makes you lazy. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, yesterday I woke up and I had all this work to do, but then I thought, you know, I think I'm just going to go for a hike with my wife. And, you know, blew off the whole, and I'm like, yeah, I can totally see that. You know, every time I get off the plane in California, I'm like, why don't we live here again? So thank you for spending an hour of a beautiful day inside with me when you could be out doing a bunch of other stuff. Obviously, I just wrote this book, which is kind of why I'm here, but I thought what I would do is just hit up some of the main ideas in the book rather than try to kind of give you a full download. And then we can, maybe in Q&A, we can kick those around and discuss some of the main stuff that comes out of it and see what you guys are most interested in talking about. I began writing the book in September of 2009 after getting ambushed in Afghanistan. It's not the first or in fact the last time that I've been ambushed in Afghanistan, but this particular one was kind of interesting. It was the classic late afternoon ambush scenario that you get in Afghanistan, because most of eastern Afghanistan has a very, very narrow set of valleys that have settlement patterns of basically people live in the bottom of the valleys. Nobody lives on the mountains themselves, and there's usually only one road running down the middle of each valley. So if you go up that valley in the morning, essentially everyone in that whole community knows exactly where you're going to be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You're going to be driving down the valley, right? And in fact, Afghan families have ambush spots like, you know, families in the Chesapeake Bay have fishing spots, or families out here. They don't have to go through the full complex planning process that an infantry small unit does when it decides to do an ambush. They basically say, hey, Abdul, get to the ambush spot, right? Because they have like 3 or 4 of them already picked out. In fact, I was in another ambush earlier in my career in Afghanistan where we actually found old .303 ammunition from like British rifles that went out of service in the 19th century up in these firing positions on either side of the road. So they'd obviously been using this ambush site for some considerable time. But I'm in the middle of this ambush and I think to myself, you know, this is a pretty bad ambush. I've become a bit of an involuntary connoisseur over the years, and I actually used to teach ambushing at the tactics school when I was a captain. So I'm like, you know, if these were my students on the battle course, I would have failed them for their ambush plan, right? It was just very badly put together. It didn't come, you know, it just didn't work. Anyway, we get to the bottom of the valley, and I'm talking to my driver of my my MRAP, which is kind of like a big armored garbage truck that we drive around in Afghanistan. And the driver says to the gunner, hey, how many Taliban guys do you reckon we killed? And I was like, well, how do you know they were Taliban? And they were like, dude, they were shooting at us. And it took me a little while. I was actually on the helicopter ride back afterwards that I began to think, you know, maybe this attack had actually nothing to do with the Taliban. And when I started to think about what we'd been doing in that valley for the preceding 2 or 3 years, and the way that we'd laid down a series of projects to help the community, and how that had actually disempowered other people in the community and created a big imbalance of resources going into some villages and not into others, I started to realize that actually there's a lot more that meets the eye in a place like Eastern Afghanistan around stuff like contracting and around denial of access to services and the way that people kind of interact with this giant tsunami of contracting and aid money that comes into Afghanistan. About 14 times the size of the total Afghan government budget is our aid programming in Afghanistan. And I began to write this book sort of trying to think beyond the paradigm of counterinsurgency. And for those people that are in the military, that's kind of like anathema. Like, what, Dave Kilcullen? You know, didn't you write a book on counterinsurgency? Yes, but it's just a book, right? And we have this paradigm that we built because it helped us to win a conflict in Iraq, and it helped us to win a variety of smaller fights in other places. But that doesn't mean that it's dogma and that's the answer forever. Like any other human model or mental picture of an environment, all it is a systematic oversimplification of very complex reality. And over time, when you start to see data that don't fit with your model, it's time to update the model, right? And so what I've been doing over the past 3 or 4 years is thinking beyond that and actually reaching back into some work that I previously did when I was in the Australian military, looking at urbanized environments. And I'm going to talk about that a lot in a minute, but I just want to set the context. Ever since 9/11, the military in particular, but also aid agencies, diplomatic services, a variety of other organizations have gotten really good at the kind of stuff that I was doing in Eastern Afghanistan when I got shot up in 2009, right? Remote environments, tribal communities, landlocked countries like Afghanistan, the work that we do in little remote frontier outposts has become, I think, dramatically better quality than it was a decade ago. But if you look at the environment that we've been operating in, it's very specific. Afghanistan's a very diffuse conflict. The conflict mostly happens in rural environments, not in the cities. It happens in this kind of landlocked, mountainous, arid, not very heavily populated environment. And most importantly, it's a very low bandwidth, low connectivity environment. Most people don't have the ability to tap into an extensive cell phone network or access to the internet or any of the sorts of things that we kind of take for granted in the modern urban world. So as I was researching the book, I sort of started to think to myself, what's going to happen after Afghanistan? Now, it's kind of become fashionable in the politics world and the foreign policy discussions in Washington to kind of act like the war in Afghanistan is already over, right? Like we don't currently have all these troops out there fighting and dying on the ground, or diplomats doing the work they're doing, or aid agencies or other people doing the hard work in Afghanistan, like that's all finished. Actually, our friends are still out there doing this stuff on the ground, and I think it's really important to not forget that. That said, it's pretty clear that the conflict is going to start winding down in the next year or two. And it's worth asking yourself, what does the future environment look like? Does it look like Afghanistan, or does it look like something else? And a lot of the book is sort of my exploration of that question. When I look at the future environment, what I see is a very high degree of what you might call operational continuity, right? The stuff that we do, we will keep on doing mostly that kind of stuff in the future environment. As an example of that, if you go back in US military history to about the middle of the 19th century, around the time of the Mexican War, and you start a timeline then and you run it forward to now, you find a really, really consistent pattern in US military history, where we do a large-scale or long-duration irregular warfare campaign about once every 20 to 25 years, and we do small ones on a scale of sort of Kosovo or East Timor or Sierra Leone about once every 5 to 10 years in between. And that pattern is not only very consistent, it appears to be totally unaffected by policymakers' preferences, right? So beginning of last year, President Obama gave direction to the US military where he said, we're going to get out of the business of doing large-scale, long-duration stabilization operations or counterinsurgency. So we're not going to structure the force for that anymore. Turns out President Clinton said basically the same thing in 1992. Candidate Bush, George W. Bush, said the same thing in 2000. President Johnson said the same thing in 1964. Like, you can run this back and you'll find about 7 presidents in the 20th century alone making basically the same comment, and it has zero effect on how often we get into these kinds of conflicts. Across the planet, since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, roughly 80% of all conflict has been intrastate, that is within communities within one country, or it's involved a non-state armed group like pirates or insurgents or some other kind of combatant that is not a nation state. So that is, in fact, that's the typical environment that we operate, or the typical type of work that we do. But the environment that we've operated in the past is not the environment that we're going to look at. So operational continuity, but a strong environmental discontinuity between what's coming and what we've been doing in the last decade, this kind of landlocked, remote, rural environment. Now, American forces, particularly the Army and the Marine Corps, were very heavily involved in urban fighting in Iraq. So talking to an American audience, it's easy to think that actually we have a lot of experience globally in urban operations. That's actually not true. There were 50 countries in Iraq, 51 in Afghanistan. The only one of those that was involved in any significant urban fighting was the American military in Baghdad. When I deployed to Baghdad and Ramadi and all the other areas around that in the American sector, when I deployed to Baghdad in February of 2007, at that time, more than 50% of total combat action in the war in Iraq was happening inside Baghdad city limits, which is a purely US theater. Everybody else engaged in the conflict was out in more remote rural environments where, frankly, there was a lot less violence going on. So for most of the 50 countries that were in Iraq, normal is not urban. Normal is farms, little villages, rural districts, not a lot of fighting, more like sort of peacekeeping and stabilization. And for everybody that went to Afghanistan, you're dealing with this kind of rural, diffuse environment. But looking forward, I see 4 big trends that are actually changing the environment and will shape how we operate or where we operate in the future. And those trends are population, urbanization, littoralization, which is just the tendency for things to cluster on coastlines, and then most importantly, electronic networked connectivity. Now those first 3 trends are old. They've been around for at least 200 years, since the beginning of the European Industrial Revolution. They're also very well understood in the military in particular. But I'm going to just talk about them briefly before I go to what I think is the more important one, which is connectivity. So population growth. At the beginning of the US Industrial Revolution in the European Industrial Revolution in 1750, the total population of the planet was about 750 million people. It took 150 years for that population to double through the sort of first century and a half of industrialization and the invention of things like new ways to think about irrigation, new ways to think about crops, concentration of population in urban environments, improvements in public health, all those sorts of things led to this kind of population growth process that began in the middle of the 18th century. By 1900, we're at 1.5 billion people, so we've doubled the population of the planet in about 150 years. We then double that population again in only 60 years by 1960. So we get to 3 billion people on the planet in 1960. And it's worth noting that that second doubling happened during the same time frame as both world wars and a major influenza pandemic across the entire planet, which between them killed about 150 million, mainly young and healthy people. So despite that, we saw this doubling by 1960 to 3 billion. The population then doubled again by the year 2000 to 6 billion, and in just the dozen years since then, we've added slightly more than 1 billion people. So today we're looking at around about 7 billion people on the planet. Projecting that forward is not a matter of simple prediction, right? It's a matter of looking at the demographic bell curve and where people are right now and where the population growth is likely to take us. But the Bureau of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN and a bunch of other organizations that look at this stuff project that by the middle of the century, we'll be looking at something like 9.5 billion people on the planet. It's about another 2.5 billion people between now and 2050. There's a projection that the population is going to top out at around that level and stay at essentially 9.5 billion by 2050. That's based on certain assumptions about what happens to birth rate when GDP increases, and they may not actually play out. So we're looking at least 2.5 billion more people on the planet in our generation. The second factor, though, is urbanization. So if you go back again to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and you think about the population of the planet at that time, roughly 2% of people on the Earth in 1800 lived in a city of 1 million or more. By 1900, it was 10%. By 1960, it was 25%. By April of 2008, it was 50%. We're currently sitting somewhere north of 50% urbanization on the planet. So roughly half the people on the planet live in a city of 1 million or more. Again, the same projections suggests that by 2050, we'll be looking at somewhere between 65 and 75% urbanization. So somewhere around the current population of the planet, 7 billion people, will be living in a large city by the middle of the century. Interestingly, that urbanization process is not only going to account for all the gross population growth on the planet, it's also going to account for a lot of people leaving rural environments and moving to the cities between now and the middle of the century. So actually, the urban environment is going to grow by roughly 3 billion people between now and the middle of the century. Roughly 1.5 million people per week migrate from a country area to a city. So roughly the same number of people that it took all of human history until 1960 to generate across the entire planet are going to move to cities within the next 30 years. Edgar Peters, who's the head of the Africa City Centre in Cape Town in South Africa, says we're looking at dramatic disruptive change in just one generation because of that urbanisation and population growth. That's not all, though. Those urban environments will not be evenly distributed across the surface of the earth. They'll be almost entirely in the developing world, in low and middle income countries. This is not a phenomenon that we see in Europe and the United States. It's a phenomenon of sub-Saharan Africa, that Mediterranean basin, South Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean. It's not evenly distributed. It's developing world cities. And those cities are overwhelmingly located on coastlines for reasons of basic physics, right? When you want to move heavy, large stuff around, for all of human history and still now, it's been a hell of a lot easier to move that around by water than on land. So cities have tended to cluster against large bodies of water on rivers or major river deltas, lakes, or on coastlines. Already today, 80% of people on the planet live within 50 miles of the sea. And of course, we're dealing with what systems theorists would call sensitivity to initial conditions here. So as urbanization takes place, it's not happening against a background of an evenly distributed, human population. Cities are already on coastlines. So as people move to existing cities, they're going to be moving to coastlines. So we're going to see a population that's incredibly clustered in urban environments in third world cities on coastlines. Obviously, that changes the environment in which we operate. But actually, the military well understood this stuff 25 years ago. So a Marine general called Krulak wrote about a thing called the Three-Block War in the 1990s, and he had guys like Ralph Peters and Robert Scales, and these are all military theorists that I'm mentioning, who really focused on the problems of what we call the urban littoral back in the 1990s. And I wrote some stuff on this. It was pretty well understood in the community at that point. But what's happened is the military since 9/11 has been dragged off into this other environment. Now, I wouldn't call Afghanistan a geographical fluke, right? There are deserts and mountains and jungles where conflict is going to occur in the future. But because conflict tends to happen where people live, and the general parameters of human civilization shape the parameters within which conflict happens, the majority of conflict on the planet, like the majority of everything on the planet, is going to happen in third world coastal cities by the middle of the century. And I can talk more in detail in the Q&A, if you like, about the data that supports that. But what's really interesting to me is not these old trends. They've been around for a long time and they're well understood. What's interesting is the new trend, which is connectivity. Now, I'm talking to a bunch of people at Google, so I probably don't need to go into the level of detail on this that I have with some of the other folks that I've spoken to, but just a couple of data points. In the year 2000, there were 30,000 cell phones in Nigeria. Today, there are 113 million. Last year, I spent some time walking around Mogadishu, engaging with the community there on some work we were doing. And, Mogadishu is a city that survived for 20 years without a government or a central state. 24% of people that live in Mogadishu own and use a cell phone. There are 4 major cell phone companies. Internet access from Mogadishu is actually a lot easier than from parts of the United States if you want to talk to people, because you're very closely geographically connected to the international undersea cable network. There's a market in the middle of Mogadishu called the Bakara market, which was the scene of a big gun battle about 20 years ago. On the ground floor of that market is a currency trading exchange where people are on the internet and on their cell phones, and they're trading the Somali shilling, which is a currency, again, that survived for 20 years without a central bank, It floats on international exchange rates. It gets updated 5 times a day. And the traders on that floor punch out a SMS text message to everybody that trades in the city 5 times a day with the current exchange rate. And so you have all these traders out there on their cell phones all the time tapping into a global pattern of commerce. And one of the things we're seeing is that access to the international networks of trade, things like remittance flows, arbitrage, the movement of currency or the movement of goods around the planet has become, it's overtaken agricultural surplus as a major driver of city growth. So Mogadishu is not a city that can be sustained by the rest of the Somali economy, right? The reason that it's there and it's that big is it's a trading city. It's always been that, but now it's not just a trading city that sends charcoal to Yemen or sends cart around the rest of the country and engages in basic commodities trading. It's also a trading city that's international because you have 800,000 Somalis in the international diaspora, and they're connected to the 7.5 million Somalis that live in the country in a way that just never was possible before. Another example, we mentioned Syria earlier. Until 2000, there was virtually no internet, no satellite television, and no cell phone access in Syria. Hafez al-Assad, the president of Syria from the 1970s, came from peasant stock. He was a bit of a Luddite. He wasn't that interested in allowing Syrians to connect to the rest of the world for a variety of obvious reasons. And he essentially denied access to all this kind of connectivity until his death in 2000. His son, though, Bashar al-Assad, was a bit more of a computer nerd. I mean, he was the president of the Syrian Computer Society before becoming president. He was a bit of an AV club guy at college. You know, he was quite interested in this issue of sort of connectivity. Ironically, under the previous regime, you could get a satellite dish, but you did that by getting it on the black market from the Syrian military, who would happily sell you one and then track all your usage of that satellite dish thereafter. But after 2000, there was this period known as the Damascus Spring, when Bashar al-Assad sort of threw open electronic connectivity, and we saw this massive surge in cell phone usage, in internet access, in access to satellite television. And actually, if you look at the other cities and other countries involved in the Arab Spring, you see a very, very similar pattern of this explosion of connectivity after 2000. When the uprising came in 2011, that fundamentally changed the way that the conflict developed in Syria. Unlike the 1980s, when the regime was able to crush one city at a time because people didn't know what was going on, this time people were able to talk to each other, and the uprising spread across about half a dozen cities on the first day, and it reached 20 cities in the first 2 weeks. And so the regime was not able to get ahead of the curve this time. The other critical difference that we've seen in all the Arab Spring conflicts is the way that a tech-savvy, connected population that is able to access technical instructions, but also physical manufacturing facilities, can rapidly generate weaponry and capabilities that just weren't available even a decade ago. And we can talk in more detail in Q&A if you like about that, but I'll just give you one example. In the Aleppo area, which is in northern Syria, last year, a bunch of guys in the Syrian Free Army downloaded a bunch of instructions off the internet and started producing their own mortar systems, which they use Google Android phones to control. They use the Compass app and a variety of calculation tables to decide where they're going to fire those mortars. They look at Google Earth as a way of targeting, and they'll use access to the internet to basically pass messages back and forth on Twitter to control the fall of shot. But also, they've downloaded instructions that will enable them to build their own armored vehicles. So in a backyard factory in Aleppo last year, a bunch of guys made this thing called Al-Shams, which is their sort of lightweight tank that has a mini miner chassis, right? It's about 6 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. It's controlled with a Game Boy console from inside. You look at a flat screen television, doesn't have a turret, which is actually the most complicated piece of an armored vehicle to build. Instead, it has a remote control weapon station with basically a robot electric motor that controls a 7.62 millimeter machine gun that sits outside the turret. And you've got a series of armored video cameras that can be replaced if they get broken, that allow the thing to basically run through a GoPro to a to a Game Boy controller, and the guy drives it around the streets of Aleppo using basically home consumer entertainment technology to control it. When I showed it to a bunch of Army guys earlier this year, they said to me, well, why would you take all that technology and put it into this tiny little armored vehicle that's only 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, and it can't fight another tank because it only has a machine gun? Well, the reason is because tanks can't get down streets in a place like Aleppo. Right? A Bradley armored fighting vehicle is about 16 feet wide, so is an Abrams tank. They're not getting there, right? They're not going to get into that environment. And it doesn't need a big gun, it needs a small machine gun for fighting infantry, because it's not going to be dealing with large armored vehicles. So this is actually a very smart technical adaptation of consumer electronics with basically well understood, internal combustion engine and the application of fire in an urban environment. But what's interesting about this is not the technology itself, it's the way that all these people concentrated in an urban environment with a high degree of connectivity have actually democratized military technology on the ground. And the way these conflicts have developed is very different from how previous irregular warfare conflicts developed. I have case studies on the book on that stuff and on things like the Mumbai attack, where the Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists from Pakistan used Twitter as their control feed to actually control the attack, and used downloads of Google Earth to understand the flow of the city and how to attack it. I have a bunch of other case studies. Probably the most interesting to me is actually the way that Jamaican drug gangs in Kingston have used urban planning decisions made in the 1960s to create these kind of garrison districts around the outside of the city and control international drug trade from slum areas around the capital city of Jamaica. But let me finish by talking about, I think, what's more germane to this discussion, which is how do we model and understand cities under stress? Because if I'm right about the future, then the future environment is going to be one of cities that are experiencing this kind of tsunami of inflow of population and information and money and drugs and weapons that come about through rapid urbanization. And it's worth thinking about how do we model and understand those, and how do we think about resiliencies to address those problems going forward. So briefly on that, in looking at this in the book, I go back to Karl Marx, weirdly enough, right? So Marx, whatever else he may have been, was a social scientist who's looking at European cities 100 years after the beginning of that industrial revolution process that I was talking about earlier. So in the 1850s, Marx is looking at Paris and Berlin and London, and he's saying, what is it about these cities that gives rise to the environment of urban squalor that is famously written about by people like Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens? Like, what is it that gives rise to that? And he talks about what he calls a metabolic rift, okay? So that people that are used to living in a rural environment, where most of the people that you rely on for day-to-day survival are people that you're either related to or you know personally, and you're in this kind of organic structure, you then find yourself in a large urban environment where everything's depersonalized, and you now rely on these large institutionalized, distantiated systems that are essentially lots of moving parts that all have to work together or the whole thing falls over. And he talks about how that creates this kind of social rift in the way that people look at each other, but it kind of disassociates them from the means of survival. This idea sits fallow in urban planning for about 100 years, and then a guy called Abel Wallman picks it up in the 1960s, who's an urban planner, and he writes an article that's actually very seminal in urban ecology, where he talks about the metabolism of cities. And Wallman's argument is pretty straightforward. It's like if you imagine your body as a system with various inputs and intakes of water, fuel, food, and so on, that come into your body, and there are transformative processes that result in energy and biomass and so on, but they also result in toxins that have to be metabolized and dealt with. And if your body doesn't have the carrying capacity, the metabolic systems in place to deal with those toxins, then you're going to get sick. He says you can apply the same idea to a city. It has various inputs and inflows, it has various transformative processes, and if the inflows overwhelm the carrying capacity of the system, then you're going to see the emergence of toxins that are going to result in stuff like pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and so on. Now, this idea is very common now in urban ecology in the physical sense, right? Carbon, water, air, how these things flow through an urban system. And there are models that we use, and there are material flow analysis systems that we apply to understand that. what I've done and what a lot of other people have done in looking at cities in the last 10 or 20 years is to do what I would call a non-material flow analysis, right? So instead of looking at water or carbon, look at information and money and people and weapons and drugs and say, does the city have the carrying capacity to deal with those flows, or is it in fact getting overwhelmed? And when you apply those kinds of models to cities under stress, it turns out you can start looking at them in a very different way. And I can give you, again, some examples in Q&A from places we've worked in Africa and Latin America to understand how a city can be seen as essentially a pattern of intersecting flows rather than just a piece of urbanized terrain. Modeling that, we have found, relies on a combination of big data, remote observation of honest signals from the urban environment with field teams that can understand what's beneath that data. So we did a lot of work initially in Afghanistan and then subsequently in Syria and a bunch of other places in looking at environments that are under stress and trying to understand what was going on by remote observation. After a while, we realized that that doesn't actually give you the answer you're looking for. It's like looking at a jungle canopy from above. You can see the trees, but you don't know what's underneath. And it turns out that you have to put a field team on the ground to figure out what is the delta between the observed data and what you can see on the ground before you can start to make predictive analysis about what you're looking at. So I'll give you one example, and unfortunately, Google doesn't come into this story because you guys charge for use of Google Earth data. But we used OpenStreetMap, which is the sort of wiki version of Google Earth, to work with a series of communities, mainly women's groups and a violence observatory in a large African city on a coastline that has a number of slums that are experiencing a really high degree of violence. Now, why women? One of the reasons that women are really important in this environment, there's actually two reasons. One is because they are consistently excluded from the analysis, right? So when you go and start looking at environments on the ground, typically you end up speaking with elite class urban males that speak English, which is a pretty small subset of the environment, actually, when you want to understand what's really going on. But much more importantly, in my view, is that something like 80% of the people that own businesses and employ people in slums are actually women. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. A lot of these slums don't have a lot of jobs. Like if you live in La Rocinha, which is a favela outside of Rio, you're not going to work in La Rocinha. You're going to work downtown where the rich people need you to sweep streets and run the airport, traffic handling, baggage handling system or drive taxis. That's where the work is if you're a guy in La Rocinha. If you want to work in the favela and you want to run a business or you want to employ people, then you're probably part of this kind of network of women small business owners that are actually pretty common in these environments. So we work with these women's groups to understand threat and risk in their slum. And if you think about it, when you walk through an urban environment, you don't know if you're going to be mugged, but you do know if it is going to happen, it'll probably be like over there. There's just something about the environment that tells you that it's risky. And we built a map which essentially reflected the community's perception of risk in different specific areas within a slum. And it's interesting when you compare that to the police data that the police have, which is, again, remote observation. You would think that the government of a large African city would know what's going on in its environment. Mostly they don't. You can look at these things and you can identify any building off of Google Earth, but if you talk to somebody from the government, it's pretty rare for them to be able to tell you what that building is. Even if they know what the building is, most of these streets don't have street names, there are no house addresses, so there's no way to record that information. So we built these kind of spatial models of where the community felt unsafe. And when we began looking at them, we realized that actually these places have a visual signature. There's something about them that's different. The size of houses, the number of bends in a given distance of road, how wide the streets are, the density of urban lighting. There's a whole variety of things that make these areas look different. And often humans can't tell that, but machines can. And when you back up to a large-scale model or a large-scale picture, just a satellite image of a city, you can start to pick these environments off the map because you know what you're looking for because you've done the field work, right? So just the big data is not enough and just the field work is not enough. The magic happens at the connectivity between field teams that understand the environment, who are almost always entirely indigenous local inhabitants of that environment, and people sitting remotely who can understand the bigger sort of large end perspective. And so a lot of what we do now in places in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East is founded on an idea that we call co-design, where we bring a small external team with certain kinds of technical or functional knowledge into an environment where they work closely under the direction of the local community. And I'm going to take this back to warfare. I really first experienced that in Iraq when we finally began to turn around what we've been doing in Iraq. And I'm going to end with this story and then I'll throw it open to questions. When I first went into Iraq in 2006, we were in freefall. 3,000 civilians were getting killed in just Baghdad city alone every week. That's a 9/11 every week. By September of 2007, we'd reduced that to the point where a few people getting killed was a bad night. 100 was a terrible week. 95% reduction in violence in just a 7-month period in Iraq. How did we do that? It wasn't because we had this great new counterinsurgency manual, right? That helped. It wasn't because we had a president who was very engaged, although we wouldn't have been able to do it without that. But actually, it was because we finally did something that we'd never really done before, which is to actually start talking to the Iraqis about how to defend their neighborhoods. So before that, we had typically gone into an Iraqi neighborhood and we would sort of swat the locals out of the way and we'd say, sit down, shut up, we have the answer to your problem. We're going to back up the sort of democracy truck. We're going to unpack the solution and you guys will be very happy with the result. And what had happened was not that. What had happened was a city that had basically torn itself apart for the sort of 12 to 18 months before the surge began. And in that time, interestingly, the period when we backed off from Baghdad, a lot of local security councils had emerged. And people had started to create these little security groups that decided we're going to figure out how to defend our own community. And they'd actually gone out and put in place a whole series of systems, right? Not just physical systems, but reporting systems and information management systems and ways of understanding their environment, which they had used to survive through most of 2006. So when we finally went back in the sort of spring of 2007 and began to re-engage with Baghdad, this time we sat down with people and we said, tell us what you've been doing for the last year and what's worked and what hasn't worked and what you need some additional help on and what we should just not touch. And you give us the sort of design brief of what we should build to support your security and your environment. And initially they were like, what? Right? Because I actually had a meeting with some guys in a place called Sada City where they were like, what? You want to know what we think? They're like, dude, we've been working with a coalition for 4 years. You're the first person that's ever asked us what we think about how to secure our district. And they were very, very suspicious. When we finally began to do this stuff, and it wasn't just me, there's people all over Iraq, they got religion because they saw that we really were serious. We were really going to listen to what they wanted to do and we're going to work with them. And we engaged in this process of co-design. And we actually designed stuff together to build a solution that would work for them. Now, there's companies here in San Francisco, like IDEO, for example, that have this idea down in terms of participatory development and urbanization. And they understand stuff like human-centered design as a way of engaging with communities that are under stress to try to build a better solution. My challenge to them and what our company's been doing has been trying to figure out how do you do that when people are shooting at you, right? How do you do it when it's so violent that you can't just sit down with people and say, hey man, what should we do? What are the ways you can observe that environment remotely and how can your field teams work on the ground to try to build what, for want of a better term, I would call peace and resilience in environments that are just not stable by definition. These cities are growing at such a rate that our traditional way of thinking about the problem, which is to bring stability, to stabilize as the IMF has it, or to bring stability operations as the military talks about, is just not going to work. If you were born in Dhaka in 1950, you would have been born in a city of 400,000 people. Today that city's 12 million. It's going to be 25 million by the middle of the century. It's not a stable system. Stability is a systems characteristic. Resiliency is a characteristic of actors in the system. Rather than trying to hold back the tide of rapid urbanization, we need to be focusing on how to teach people to swim. And that's a lot of what most people that are working in this environment are now doing. So USAID and a lot of the other aid agencies have now a resiliency agenda for how they're going to bring the kind of systems to communities that allow them to be resilient in the face of rapid change. And I think circling back to that Afghan ambush, that's what we need to be looking at going forward, right? Not remote, rural, mountainous environments where you don't have a lot of connectivity and you don't have a high population density. We've become really, really good at operating in that environment in the last decade. But the future environment is not that. It's big cities on coastlines in the developing world with an enormous degree of connectivity. And there's a massive upside set of opportunities to lift people out of poverty, to bring all kinds of benefits to communities that don't have them now, to actually generate peace as distinct from just the absence of conflict. That opportunity is there alongside a huge set of risks that will confront us if we don't deal with this massive population tsunami that's bearing down on coastal cities in the next generation. So let me stop there and sort of summarize by saying we need to get our heads out of the mountains, right, and start thinking about this future urban environment. And I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. So I don't know how you want to run it. If you guys want to nominate, and we'll go from there.
When we were speaking earlier, you had talked about inoculating cities with some resiliency as they're going through this rapid growth. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
So great point, Chris. So we're not just talking about cities that are there now, right? One projection by the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, which is kind of like their HUD organization, is that the entire west coast of India is going to be one single giant conurbation by 2040, right? So large slums will fill in the currently existing space between existing cities. There's a guy called Mike Davis out in Hawaii who's written a number of really good books, one of which is called Planet of Slums, where he projects that we're going to see this kind of giant slum sprawl fill in the space between existing cities. So the sort of paradox is that a lot of the problems of urbanization that we're going to see in the next generation are going to happen in cities that aren't there yet, right? Because they haven't happened yet. And so part of this is about getting ahead of the curve and thinking about what do these kinds of environments need to channel them into a pathway of urban development that's going to result in a different future, right? And I'm trying in the book not to predict a kind of dystopian view, right? If you want that, go read Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson, right? Which is like 15 years old, but it's all there, right? I mean, it's California, right? So, this stuff's been figured out, as a sort of dystopian vision already. What I'm doing is making a projection based on current data and saying it doesn't have to be that future, right? It can actually be different. And I think it's about thinking about where will cities grow to and what happens when rapid unchecked urban growth accretes around an existing city, right? So you get this kind of donut-shaped or horseshoe-shaped ring of terrain that clusters around an existing city, but it didn't used to be empty terrain. That's where the city grew its food. It's where the water catchment area was. It's where a lot of the transportation routes come through, right? So you have this ring of slums that emerge around a city that separates the city from the sources of all those critical commodities, the inflows of the metabolism, right, that it needs to survive. And these are areas where you don't have a lot of government presence, you don't have a lot of government services, and so non-state armed groups often emerge and end up controlling these environments. And they don't just smuggle drugs, they actually provide governance services in these environments. And it's typical of governments to look at these as a threat. I don't see them that way at all, right? These are people who are engaging in stuff that the government either can or won't do, that the population needs, right? They're actually fulfilling a central function to the existence of the city. But what it means if you're an urban politician downtown is there's now a ring of territory that's like a gauntlet around the city, and all the supplies that the city needs to survive have to run that gauntlet every day. And there's a non-state armed group, a militia or a communitarian group that's sitting astride that, and you're going to have to deal with that group, because if you don't, they can shut the city down, right? So I think it's stuff like that, right? It's understanding how do we enable urban growth in a way that isn't going to generate the kind of urban exclusion and marginalization and political dispossession of these people that then creates the ground in which all this stuff takes place. And for the military guys, how are we going to operate in giant cities like this, which could absorb a Marine regiment or an Army division and not even notice, right? It's going to have to be different from the traditional way that we've thought about operational maneuver from the sea or maneuver operations in a littoral environment, because it's just so big now that you're looking at a whole different space. Anyway, a lot more to talk about on that, but I think getting ahead of the curve is about predicting where are the problems going to be in cities that haven't even happened yet, and how do you understand the resiliencies that prevent this kind of symptoms from developing and just stop them in their tracks.
Thanks for coming. Let's see, Max Boot spoke here recently. He's the author of the book on guerrilla warfare. And at one point he said, I think I'm quoting him right, that urban areas were not very friendly for guerrillas. And his reason was that it's too exposed. You can't have meetings and organize. You can't do rifle practice. Clearly, you disagree. Do you think that's a factor? Or
Well, I think Max produced a great book in his latest book, and I have a lot of respect for his point of view. And I think if you look at the big sweep of history of guerrillas, which is what he's doing in the book, he's right that traditionally guerrillas don't operate in cities and haven't had a great degree of success in cities. And the reason for that is guerrillas go to where the cover is, right? They go to where they can hide. And for most of human history, that's been mountains and jungles. But today we have foliage-penetrating radar that can see through jungles. And we've got drones that can sit on top of a mountain range 24 hours a day and tell you where the bad guys are. There's not a lot of cover in the rural environment anymore. The cover is in the cities. And there's another key idea that comes in here, which is the idea of legibility. So there's a great guy up at Yale called James C. Scott, who's a professor. I don't think you can be a professor of anarchist studies, but that's basically what he is. And he wrote an awesome book called Seeing Like a State, where he talks about how what governments try to do is they try to make environments legible, right? So they can read and interpret. And if you work in Google, you basically work in a giant legibility project, right? Trying to make the entire planet legible so that people can understand that and do things with it. There are huge parts of the planet that are not legible, and most of those places now are in cities, right? They're not in well-developed, well-designed cities. They're in these clusters of slums where there's no street addresses and there's no house numbers, and you can spot a building from space, but you don't know what's there, and there's no way to understand who lives there. Now that we have things like GDELT, right, the global database of events, language, and tone, which has been built for about 15 years or so, and we have Twitter feeds that we can geolocate, and there's things that are emerging that allow us to make cities more legible than they've been in the past. But I believe the balance has shifted so that the urban environment is now the safer environment for irregular operators compared to the countryside. That doesn't mean we won't see conflict in the mountains and in the jungles. Like, we most definitely will. But irregular conflict tends to happen where people live. The vast majority of people are going to be in urban environments, and the city now is the area where you've got more cover than the rural environment. So I think Max is right as a historical statement about what the history of irregular conflict has been, but I think we're kind of at a watershed where going forward, we're going to see increasing preponderance of this kind of conflict happening, not in downtown cities, but in slums and in this ring of uncontrolled, illegible territory around the outside.
So you talk about where you think the slums are going to grow and try to get ahead of it, but it seems like any service you do in that area before the slums is just going to draw the people there and bring the slum sooner. If you put schools in parks, you're just going to end up with slums at the schools and parks.
Right.
How do you get ahead of it when the real problem is just too much people with not enough jobs?
Right. Great. This is a great point. In fact, there's a woman called Sheila Patel who runs an organization called Spark in Mumbai who makes this point, right? She says, the government has decided not to provide services to people in slums because that they think is going to attract people to the slums. One of the great examples of that is sanitation. So the Indian government says that an acceptable level of sanitation is 1 toilet per 50 people. Right now it's 1 toilet per 600 people in many of the slums in Mumbai. And she says, as if people move to slums just because they want access to a toilet, right? There's plenty of places to crap in the woods, right? Actually, people are moving to cities because of economic opportunity. And I also think, and we see this in a number of places, because of the connectivity differential between rural environments and the urban environment. If now the way that you make your money is by access to a globalized economy, and you need connectivity to do that, and there's a connectivity differential between the rural environment where you don't have that connectivity and the urban environment when you do, then one of the major reasons why people are moving to cities is because that's where the Wi-Fi is, that's where the internet is, that's where the density of cell phone coverage is that allows you to tap into that environment. So I think that tells you that there are 3 ways to really address this. One is to sort of attack the supply side, right? To do things in the rural environment that make it better for people that are there so that they don't decide, hey, we're going to pick up and move to urban environments at quite the same rate. So, more rural Wi-Fi, better access to cell phones in the countryside, water, sanitation, education, conflict resolution, in the kinds of conflicts we're talking about here that will still happen in the rural environment, that's a sort of that's a supply side problem of how do you address people deciding to move to the city. Then in the city itself, there are all these resiliency interventions that you can undertake in order to make it harder for conflict to break out, to create ways to resolve that conflict quicker, and to bring in the kinds of services that prevent conflict from developing in the first place, right? So they're kind of the demand side. How do you increase the carrying capacity of an urban system in such a way that it can handle the flow? But then ultimately, though, I think nothing we can do is going to stop the giant, tendency of populations to move to urban environments. It's more about helping people cope better, right, with the environment they find themselves in than about sort of turning off the tap.
I just have trouble seeing how to grow resiliency when it means a slum is stronger because more people live there. I mean, that's resiliency. In the anti-fragile sense, you get stronger because more people come.
Yeah.
I don't see how to do that.
There's actually, well, you should buy my book then, because there's a lot of case studies in there. And the last chapter, I look at several examples of things that I think suggest ways to think about this. I would just say I'm not suggesting that I have the answer, right? What I'm doing is pointing to two things. One is there's this problem out there, which we need to be thinking about. And I think that actually in the urban studies environment, and actually a lot of people in the data science community, people are already thinking about that. But the military has been kind of sidetracked into this other environment for the last decade. And as we come back out of that environment, I think we have to put that conversation back together again and have people that really understand, military and law enforcement and all these kinds of other kinds of operations in the environment re-engage with a debate that's actually moved on a lot in the last 12 years while we've been busy in Afghanistan. And the other thing that I think is to re-emphasize this issue of littoral, because being on a coastline is different from being in a city elsewhere, right? Just one example of that. Last year, for the first time in history, there was a simultaneous outbreak of cholera in 4 West African countries during the monsoon season. And the reason for that is people have moved to slums on the outskirts of these cities. A lot of those slums are built on stilts over the sea. They don't have sanitation. There was a tidal storm surge that pushed a lot of sewage from these slums into the inland water system and infected lots of people with cholera. But all these cities are connected with each other through coastal shipping and air transportation so that the infection spread nearly simultaneously. There's a very interesting study by the World Health Organization where they look at how air travel in particular completely invalidates our traditional way of handling infectious disease. If you have the right incubation period and you posit the idea of a continued air traffic system, it can be around the entire system before the first patient gets sick. So instead of having breakout in one country and you then contain that, you can have simultaneous outbreak in basically every continent except Antarctica because of the way the air transportation system works. Who runs baggage handling systems in most of the world? Who is the workforce in most airports? It's people that don't live in the rich districts downtown. It's people that live in the slums around the outside, right? So I think this is the sort of stuff where, we need to be really engaging to think about how do we get ahead of the curve. And maybe we can't, right? Maybe you're right. I hope that's not true, but it's at least worth thinking about it, I think.
Hey, thanks for coming. I kind of wanted to ask about, if we have this large population growth over the next 30 years, have all these people moving into cities, and then simultaneously from other people, particularly like futurists like Peter Diamandis and such, you have kind of these ideas that talk about, well, we'll have more and more technology, we'll have to stop worrying about, low-level agriculture so much as, more of that's, we'll just say automated. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of what, like the job or like what the working situation looks like for people in these cities as we get these giant populations.
Yeah. I've looked at that in a little bit of detail, but not actually as much as I would like to. I think there's a whole additional study here that's not only focused on employment, but is focused on the intersection of various things that the aid and development community kind of takes for granted, right? So I had an interesting discussion with the Gates Foundation last year about maternal health and infant mortality. And of course, if you're running a private philanthropic organization, you have to define what your field of action is going to be, right? And if that's your field of action, that's where you're going to focus. But the fact is, if you come up with effective maternal health and infant mortality programs now, you better have an education plan for 5 or 6 years from now, and you better have an employment plan for 18 years from now, or you're going to end up with what happened to the Libyans, where the Libyans did a great job in the 70s and 80s improving public health, which resulted in a youth bulge, which resulted in a lot of people hitting college age, and the Libyan education system was well developed for making people literate, giving them skills in English, and helping them become very politically aware. But it was really bad at generating people that had skills that were relevant to the Libyan economy, which is basically oil and gas. So you had this massive number of expats doing those jobs, and a lot of people coming out of Libyan colleges ended up working for the civil service, because basically they just created this giant public service in order to absorb all these people that didn't have usable skills. Then you had these government departments that were basically just jobs programs and didn't exist to provide any service to the community. So you had this breakdown of trust between the government and the population, and this giant urban unemployment or underemployment challenge. And that was the recruiting pool from which people sprung in 2011 against the regime, when they began seeing places like Dubai and Kuwait on the television, which they'd never had access to until 2003. And they're like, hang on a second, how come those guys are living like that and we're living like this, right? So I think that issue is critically important. Figuring out the intersections of all these different programs and how they work together. I think, and this is just my point of view, based on not a huge amount of data, but just based on observing a lot of these cities, there's a lot of jobs out there that are emerging through kind of self-synchronization at the local level, right? So if you want to go on, your Google mapping app and you live in Lagos and you want to check the traffic, it's useless because it's red all the time, right? It's just, Lagosians have words for traffic like Eskimos have words for snow, right? There's so many people there. It's the infrastructure of a medium-sized town with a population the size of Australia, basically, right? And it's always red. But there are about 25 different local level radio stations that only broadcast for a few blocks, where people call in and tell the radio DJ like what's going on with traffic, and you don't go on Google to find out traffic. You just change, people have written up on their window the frequencies of these local radio stations, and they just change from one to another as they move through, and they've basically self-synchronized their own traffic information system based on totally analog means, in that environment. So there's a lot of those kinds of things. And there's also a kind of cognitive elite, which is not the machine, it's the marriage of machine and human that's actually driving forward a lot of the economic development in places that we see. I can talk about that offline if you want, because it's a whole other discussion. But then there's a lot of people that are basically dispossessed because of this change. And what happens to those people will drive a lot of what happens in these environments, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for coming. Let's have a warm hand for
Hey, thank you for having me. Yeah.